Will the Falcons be able to take advantage of Tua's untapped potential to make him into the next Sam Darnold success story?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons. I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are talking about why the Falcons trading for Giants D-tackle Dexter Lawrence is not as ludicrous as at least I initially thought it would be. We'll break that down. We'll talk about why we need to be worried about James Pearce's on-field production this year, in addition to the off-field stuff. But we will start today's episode talking about, Tua's reclamation potential. And this stems from a question that a Locked On Falcons insider asked me last month. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider, hit the link in the description below. It's $4.99 per month, but it's a 14-day free trial, and you get priority on future episodes when you ask me questions for the podcast. But Alex asked, could you talk about your opinion on Tua having a Baker Mayfield / Sam Darnold-esque resurgence, and what you think allows those kind of resurgences to happen? So, Alex, we won't go too deeply into every take I have on this, but and on what the causes are for that, we'll just focus on one aspect of it. But I think the short answer is no, I don't think Tua is going to have that type of resurgence. And the quick reason why is mostly because I feel like Miami got, basically wrung every drop of talent out of Tua across the last, 6 seasons, as opposed to thinking the Falcons are going to be able to tap into that. And I think sort of the area that we'll focus on for today is, I think that a big part of what leads to some of these resurgences that you're referring to, or these successful reclamation projects, I think it's just underlying talent. And when we look at guys like Ryan Tannehill and Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold, I think a lot of these guys were far more talented players than Tua Tagovailoa, and the teams that were able to find success with them as their quarterbacks were able to tap into that potential when previous teams were not able to do that. And, this is obviously a subjective opinion, but, pretty much everything we talk about on this podcast is subjective, but I think if you are looking back over the last 10, 12 years, right, going back to, let's say, 2015, that Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota draft, and just looking at the first round quarterbacks taken in every draft since then, and you're just basing it purely off of physical tools. So we're thinking about arm strength and athleticism and whatnot, that I would argue that Tua is probably the second least talented quarterback of any first-round quarterback taken. That the only quarterback that I would probably say is less talented than Tua in terms of just the physical tools is probably Mac Jones. And I know that I'll get pushback for that opinion. It's like, well, he was a top 5 pick in 2020. And it's like, sure, but I don't think he would be a top 5 pick in 2026. I think how we evaluate and how we project these quarterbacks has evolved a lot in the last 6 years, in large part due to struggles of, pocket quarterbacks like Josh Rosen and Tua in the league and whatnot, and wanting guys that have the big time arm. But, I think that's a big part of why Darnold has been successful, is because like he had a lot of untapped potential. And I know a lot of people may not believe this now, but certainly I think a lot of people would be surprised by how Sam Darnold was perceived in his final years at USC before entering the NFL. Now, it wasn't quite on par with guys like Andrew Luck and Trevor Lawrence and Caleb Williams as guys that we had sort of penciled in like 2 years ahead of their respective drafts. Is like, that's a future number 1 overall pick. But Darnold probably was in that next tier in terms of how he was perceived going into those last 2 years at USC, that to the point that, Darnold was picked in 2018. But if you go rewind the clock to the 2017 draft, which was the Mitch Trubisky, Patrick Mahomes, Deshaun Watson draft, the rhetoric going into that draft was, oh, you don't want to take a quarterback this year because Sam Darnold is going to be available next year, in a similar way to how people talk about like Arch Manning next year and whatnot. And you talk about the build up to that 2018 draft, which is kind of the opposite of the current draft, where like for most of that offseason, really until the week of the draft, we didn't really know who was going to be the number one pick. Right. And in contrast to this year, where basically since the end of the season, we've known who the number one pick was going to be. And Darnold was the presumptive favorite to be the number one overall pick for the Browns for most of that offseason. And then basically what happened the week before the draft was the then general manager of the Browns, John Dorsey, basically told his, everybody else in that building, including Hugh Jackson, the then head coach, that they were going to take Baker Mayfield number one. And then, it leaked to the media like 5 minutes after that team meeting when they had their final draft meeting. And then the rest was history. But, when it comes to Tua, I just don't think there's untapped potential. Like the point of that is to just indicate that like Sam Darnold is a very talented quarterback, and his struggles in New York aside, I think the last couple of years teams have been able to tap into that potential. And I just don't think that exists for Tua. I think Miami got the most out of him. Probably the one thing that you're looking at here in Atlanta that you can say, well, the Dolphins didn't necessarily maximize this over the last 6 years is the under center stuff. But as we discussed on the podcast in the past, like Tua has never really been that much of an under center guy, right? Only about 10% of his snaps across 6 seasons in Miami came under center. He also was not primarily an under center guy at Alabama. He did more under center stuff, relatively speaking. And the data I've seen, at least that was posted midway through his final year at Alabama before his injury, about a third of his snaps were under center. And about 60% of those snaps, under center snaps, were run plays. So when you boil it down to all of his passes, only about a quarter of all of his passes were under center. And, again, maybe the Falcons can get more out of that. But again, as we've discussed, like Tua has been his least effective as an under center quarterback in the NFL. And so sort of being like, well, he projected reasonably well as an under center quarterback 7 years ago in college, I don't think really is that applicable at this point in time. And so, like I said, the idea that Atlanta is going to be able to tap into some potential that Miami wasn't necessarily doing, I just have a hard time buying that. And, I'm going to, this is only going to be funny to me, but, it is what it is. I do this podcast to entertain myself, and you entertaining you guys is a side project, a side quest. But like, I might start calling Tua the Daywalker. If you recall the movie Blade, where like they called Blade the Daywalker, and they said he had all, if you don't know Blade, whatever, you're not gonna get this. But hey, read a book. They called Blade the Daywalker, and they were like, he has all of our strengths and none of our weaknesses, right? And like Tua, to me, when you compare him to like Kirk and Michael Penix, has like all of their weaknesses and none of their strengths. That's not an actual true statement, because I think he does have some overlapping strengths with Kirk Cousins, but like all the weaknesses that you think of with Michael Penix, like Tua has those same weaknesses. All the weaknesses you think of with Kirk Cousins, Tua has those same weaknesses, and then he has some of the strengths of Kirk Cousins. I don't think he's as strong in some of those areas as Kirk is, but that's worthy of debate. So Tua to me is kind of the Daywalker, the opposite of the Daywalker, which we're not going to use that term on the podcast before someone gets twisted and my bosses get a phone call. But that is kind of how, at least for me, I find that funny. So for the other 4 people listening to the show that also get a kick out of that, that's for you. And this podcast is for you. But, I think that's going to be one of the challenges, particularly this offseason, to getting back to Alex's question in all seriousness, is, and we talked about this back in February after the Seahawks won the Super Bowl, where it's like everybody's going to be looking for the next, oh, he could be the next Sam Darnold. He could be the next Sam Darnold. And like, that's the problem with outliers, where people don't understand how outliers work, where like the reason why they're outliers is because they don't happen again. Whether we're talking about Micah Parsons, whether we're talking about a Brock Purdy, a Puka Nacua, who's the next one of those guys. Richard Sherman's a great example. If you want to go back even deeper, where everybody and their mama was out here searching for the next Richard Sherman, from like 2013 to 2016, including the Falcons with, draft picks like Jalen Collins. And I remember writing about on falcfans.com back then, in 2015. Like he could be the next Richard Sherman. And that's part of the reason why like I'm so staunchly, because I learned the lesson of like, oh yeah, this is an outlier. And so these things don't happen twice. It's certainly they don't happen like in back-to-back years or anything like that. So I'm sure we'll continue to unpack like ways that the Falcons can maximize Tua in their way, but I don't think it's going to be to the same level that Miami was able to do is basically my stance. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I hope that generally answers your question, Alex. There's a lot more to unpack about why reclamation projects are successful. It's a certain amount of reps. I think a big part of it is just like you got to get a certain amount of reps in the NFL that you can just kind of figure out, when you're a young quarterback and you're still trying to figure things out, like the successful reclamation projects have basically figured out all the things that they need to figure out. And, that's a big part of it. Tua's check that box, right? With 6 starting, 5.5, I guess, years of starting. But, so that doesn't necessarily apply. But some of the other factors, like, again, some untapped potential, I think is another part of it. And I don't really see that for Tua. But enough on Tua. Let's talk about the Falcons starting their offseason program on Tuesday. And we know one player who won't be there. That's James Pearce Jr. And we're going to try to stick mainly to football. But there's the fact that he won't be there is a contributing factor to why we have growing concerns about some potential year 2 regression with James Pearce. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. This time of year, financial stress is something that a lot of people are carrying right now, and it's not just about the numbers. It can affect your sleep, your relationships, your overall mental health in ways that build up over time. And the reality is struggling with money doesn't mean that you failed. It just sometimes means that you haven't had the right kind of support. And given that I predominantly have mostly a male audience, we're expected to be the breadwinners, the providers, and those sort of expectations add an extra layer of stress, and that pressure can spill over into other areas of your life. And therapy isn't about getting financial advice. It's about working through stress, working through the anxiety and the emotions that come with it. And with over 30,000 licensed therapists and more than 6 million people served, BetterHelp is going to make it easier to get matched with one of those licensed therapists and start focusing on what you need. So when life feels overwhelming, therapy can help. Sign up today and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp.com/lockedon. So before we get into, no James Pearce for the offseason, I want to let you guys know about the Everydayer Club. And if you're looking to get some of this sweet Locked On merch, I had a door-to-door salesman come up and they just couldn't stop staring at this sweet Locked On logo. And if you want to draw all the eyeballs, you can do so by joining the Everydayer Club. That's one of many perks you get from joining. Access to an exclusive Locked On merch store, and you can find all that information as well as the other perks available at the link in the description or lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So we got the report on Monday from Ian Rappaport that James Pearce is not expected to be in attendance for the Falcons voluntary offseason program that kicks off on Tuesday, April 7th. And I imagine, this was a mutual agreement between the player and the coach. In the organization, I should say. The organization's like, hey, James, let's stay away. And James, being like, oh, I got some other things I got to deal with, means that I can't really focus on being in the building every single day for the next few weeks in this phase of the offseason. And, as we talk about some of the legal situation with James Pearce, he does have a hearing at the end of the month. I think it's the week of the draft. And from my understanding, that'll be when he has his last chance to plea down his current charges to lesser charges. And if you recall, when we first discussed this back at the beginning of February, we sort of discussed that the expectation, the likeliest outcome was that James Pearce would be able to plea down on some of these charges from the jump. So we'll see if that happens. But we'll leave the legal stuff aside here on the pod and just kind of stick to football, which is, what we know best. We have talked about James Pearce being better with his hands. That was something before his arrest that we talked about wanting to see growth there for him. And that's a way that he can continue to develop as a pass rusher if he can do a better job timing his hands with the chops and the swipes and whatnot, because James Pearce does not necessarily have elite bend when it comes to being that speed rusher that can turn the corner, right? He tends to be a little bit high cut, and he tends to struggle to flatten and finish when he beats that offensive tackle to his outside shoulder. And you can tell that by going back and watching a lot of his sacks from last year. You're not going to really see any significant examples of him, sort of beating that guy, flattening and finishing around the edge. You do sort of see him kind of running the arc a little bit, where he gets kind of pushed wide outside of the pocket, and then the quarterback, winds up holding onto the ball, trying to flee the pocket, and he's able to chase that guy down from behind. As opposed to the quarterback stepping up in the pocket, usually because there's another pressure point that causes the quarterback to not be able to step up in the pocket. And so, you want to have James Pearce improve those hands so that he can have a cleaner edge to turn that corner. And you can get that if you can improve your hand usage and basically prevent the offensive tackle from putting his hands on you by using your hands to prevent that. And so, that's our main concern with James Pearce on the field, as opposed to the other issues off the field. But you do wonder a little bit with all the off-field stuff, is he putting in the time, the energy and whatnot to work on those things this offseason, as opposed to dealing with all the other stuff that he's dealing with and has been dealing with this offseason. And it's worth noting, because we often point out on this podcast that development is not linear. And oftentimes people assume it is, because they look at James Pearce and they go like, oh yeah, 10.5 sacks as a rookie, so he'll get 12 or 15 sacks in his second NFL season, because that's how that works. And it doesn't work that way. We've discussed many times on the podcast before where sack production is already volatile, and then you throw in the top that James Pearce was already potentially due for potential regression anyway, just because when you look at some of his metrics, his advanced metrics, rather than just simply looking at the sack totals, it may not suggest that he's guaranteed to be a perennial double-digit sack guy, right? If you look at his PFF win rate last year, his pass rush win rate of 10.9, right, coupled with a pressure rate of 13.6. And so if you look at all the other edges that had a win rate between 10.5 and 11.5, and then you look at guys that had of those guys that had a pressure rate between 13 and 14%, you would find 4 other pass rushers: and Baron Browning, DeMarcus Lawrence, Bradley Chubb, and Trayvon Walker. And those 4 guys averaged 5 sacks last year. And then when you look at Brandon Thorne's true sack rate, which is meant to qualify sack production as opposed to quantify it, Pearce had 4 high quality sacks out of his 12, and he got 12 sacks because half sacks count as the full sacks in this metric. So about 33% of his sacks were high quality. And for those that don't know what a high quality sack is, according to Brandon Thorne, it's basically when you win 1-on-1 or 1-on-2 with a blocker, and you win because of the pass rusher skill, pass rush move, or his athletic ability. So really more indicative of, skill, as opposed, which is much more repeatable in our eyes, right? And then you look at the other edge rushers that had those double-digit sacks. In total, 21 of those had them, and on average of those 21, about 43% of their sack production was high quality. So James Pearce was already below that number. And then you couple in specifically coverage and cleanup sacks, right? 33%. He had 4 of those. So again, another 33% of his sack total were coverage and cleanup sacks. And of those 21 double-digit guys, that was the 5th highest percentage of that group. And so that's why I say, he was already probably likely due for regression in terms of his sack production, not to mention the fact that, for half the season, he had 0.5 sacks, which kind of tells you that the streak, the run he went on in the second half of the season, which was very impressive, probably isn't what you should assume is going to be his baseline moving forward. So, he was already due for regression. You throw in the legal issues, that's certainly not going to help. And whatnot. And so, presumably he's going to be away from the facility for the foreseeable future. Mandatory minicamp is not until, I believe, mid-June this year. And so, off-field stuff aside, if you're hoping for, James Pearce to come back strong and as an on-field player for the Falcons this year. You're just going to have to hope that all that time away from the facility, he is, going extra hard when it comes to working on his game and finding ways to improve. And so we'll see if that shows up this upcoming season, but we'll leave that conversation for future episodes and get to the news of the day around the NFL, which is Giants defensive tackle Dexter Lawrence has requested a trade. And initially I was like, there's no chance the Falcons are going to make that trade. And so I wasn't even initially planning on talking about it on the podcast. But then I started thinking, well, are you telling me there's a chance? And we'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So like I said, the news of the day is that Giants defensive tackle Dexter Lawrence has requested a trade. Lawrence, being 28 years old, has 2 more years left on his deal. He signed an extension back in 2024 for $22.5 million a year. And nowadays that puts him as the 12th highest paid interior defensive lineman. And you look at recent deals that guys like Milton Williams with the Patriots and Jordan Davis with the Eagles have signed in the last calendar year. Those have averaged $26 million a year. You have Chris Jones right now, who is the highest paid interior D lineman, according to overthecap.com, making slightly less than $32 million a year. You imagine Dexter Lawrence is looking at, that ticking clock where he's not going to have, much of an opportunity to get back to the open market in 2 years when he'll be 30. So this is really his last chance to, potentially break the bank. And I would assume that whoever acquires Dexter Lawrence will have to pay him at minimum $27 million a year, if not possibly over $30 million a year. And Dexter Lawrence is well worth it. If you don't know, Dexter Lawrence is one of the best D tackles in the league. He's in that Chris Jones, Jeffrey Simmons, Quinnen Williams tier of, interior D lineman that's in the conversation for being the NFL's best D tackle. And speaking of sack volatility, he's a good example of that because he had 0.5 sacks this year after a career high 9 sacks last year. So don't get it twisted. Like, this is one of the NFL's most disruptive and dominant interior D linemen in the NFL, even if you're looking at the sack production, but like, he ain't all that. And I shouldn't have to sell you on why Dexter Lawrence would be a great addition for the Atlanta Falcons, regardless of the cost, just purely as a football player, because pretty much any and everything that you guys are hoping that the Falcons are going to find at the D tackle position in this year's draft, you're hoping for like the 7% chance that player turns into Dexter Lawrence. And so Dexter Lawrence is already the player that you're hoping to land in this upcoming draft. But, the reason why initially I was kind of like, oh, well, this is not going to happen. And then I had to second guess it because I was like, well, you're going to have to make a similar trade like the Cowboys did for Quinnen Williams, right? Williams, same age as Dexter Lawrence, 28 now. And we saw the Jets trade Quinnen Williams to the Cowboys midseason, and the Cowboys gave up a first-round pick for that, second-round pick, as well as a D tackle in Massey Smith. But then when I actually looked at the specific picks that the Cowboys gave up, I noticed it was a 2027 first-round pick and a 2026 second-round pick, in addition to Massey Smith. And I'm like, wait a second. The Falcons have a 2027 first-round pick. They have a 2026 second-round pick. And we have a early round D tackle that hasn't quite lived up to expectations. Just ask Jarvis Davis. And you can, Ruke Orhorhoro, if you don't know what I'm putting down. So in theory, the Falcons can just offer the Giants the exact same package that the Cowboys gave to the Jets for Quinnen Williams. And so for that brief second, I'm like, it's plausible. It's possible the Falcons could make that offer for Dexter Lawrence. Now, to be clear, I don't want to give anybody any false hope. I don't think this trade is on the horizon. And certainly one would wonder, if there were multiple bids for Dexter Lawrence, as you would imagine, the Giants would probably prefer a first round pick in 2026 as opposed to 2027. And obviously if that is, a sticking point for the Giants, like the Falcons aren't going to be able to outbid another team if they offer their 2026 first round pick. But at the same time, I do wonder a little bit, if you're the Giants, are you going to be as willing to trade, want that 2026 first versus the 2027 first? Now, it's a tricky question because the general manager of the Giants, Joe Shane, is currently on the hot seat, and I'm sure he wants the pick right now because he wants to save his job, which is probably why I don't expect the Giants to trade Dexter Lawrence, because the GM is like, nah, man, I ain't trying to get fired to trade him for draft capital that I'm not going to get a chance to use. But there may be other people in that building that maybe have a little bit more job security, like a John Harbaugh, that may be more enticed by a 27 pick because that extra ammunition, if you're the Giants, would be useful in 2027 in the event that you decide that, hey, this upcoming season doesn't go the way that you want it to go for Jackson Dart, and you need to pivot off of Jackson Dart and get into that, rich quarterback class. That is definitely going to be the case, where we're not going to be sitting here a year from now being like, oh, that 27 draft class did not live up to the hype. Again, we got to find some type of optimism here on the podcast, guys. And so having 2 firsts in 2027 would be great ammunition if the Giants, and you need to make sure that you get a quarterback, right? And you also have the situation where the expectation from a lot of folks, and again, I'm by no means an expert, but there's going to be some blue chip prospects in the 27 draft at the top of that draft, unlike what many people have labeled the 26 draft as lacking the blue chip prospects at the premium positions. Let's say that they have blue chip prospects at like safety and linebacker and running back this year, but not quite at some of those premium positions like corner and wide receiver, where you have Ohio State's Jeremiah Smith and Notre Dame's Leonard Moore, or just a couple of names that people are like, oh, that's a top 5 pick next year, in addition to the quarterback. So, just spitballing here on the podcast, where it's like, oh, it's like, Dexter Lawrence, probably not going to happen. It's like a 2% chance it's going to happen for the Falcons. But again, it's 2% better than 0%. That when I first saw that news, I'm like, man, it's not even worthwhile for me even to talk about this on the podcast. So though that was my thinking. And so if you want to hold on to the pipe dream that the Falcons will somehow be able to trade for Dexter Lawrence and it will solve all the Falcons defensive line issues, which it absolutely would. Again, your mileage may vary when you think, oh, would you give up this year's 2 Ruke Orhorhoro and next year's 1 for Dexter Lawrence? Again, he's worth it. Again, the question is, are you willing to do it? And then on top of that, potentially pay him $30 million a year to be the anchor of your defense. Again, just to see his sack dance, more than one time this upcoming season, I think it's worth it. But we'll see. So your mileage may vary. So just worth discussing here on the podcast. Tomorrow, we're going to try to get a guest on, get some different perspectives on the Falcons in the draft coming up on the pod. So if you don't miss an episode, that is a great opportunity to do that. And of course, if you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. You get Locked On Falcons ad-free. You get members-only Discord access, linked to a sweet Locked On merch store, as well as other perks. All you got to do is head on over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. Guys, it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.